Hi everyone, it's Professor Hall. Welcome back. Today we're talking about the book Like Water for Chocolate by Laura Esquivel. Quick facts. So we're going to have here an overview of the book, then we'll go into a little bit about the author, a little bit about the historical period where it takes place, and then we'll talk about themes and symbols and that kind of thing. The book was published in Mexico in 1989. It depicts the life of a wealthy Mexican family during the Mexican Revolution. We follow the story of Tita, the youngest sister in a matriarchal family. So her mother is really running things, even though the book kind of takes place in a patriarchal society, which is part of what makes it interesting. Tita cooks for her family, and her emotions are transmitted through her food in an almost magical way. Very often in literature, this is called magical realism, and we'll get into some definitions and some controversies about magical realism in a little bit. Tita's mother, Mama Elena, follows the tradition that the youngest girl in the family should not marry, but rather should stay single and take care of her mother and the household, which also makes Tita wonder, who's going to take care of me when I'm older? In the first 4 chapters of the novel, we see Tita under her mother's rule. She's denied the right to marry Pedro, the man she loves. He marries her sister, Rosara, in order to stay close to Tita. Now, I don't want to spoil too much. I just want to kind of set this up for you so you know what to expect. So, chapters 5 through 8 feature Tita's rebellion as she struggles with her identity and these roles she's been kind of forced into with her family. And we also see her creative output through food and through a few other things as well, and how this oppression not only affects her but her sisters and her community, other people that come into the story. And then chapters 9 through 12 focus on Tita's fulfillment and development into adulthood. So how does this whole system play a role not only when she's a young woman but when she's an older adult, and what happens to her life and the lives of those she loves. So a little bit about the author. Born in 1950 in Mexico City, Laura Esquivel began writing while working as a kindergarten teacher. She wrote plays for her students to perform and eventually moved on to writing children's television programming in the 1970s. Like Water for Chocolate was her first novel, published in 1989. But since that time, she's written more than 10 other books, fiction and creative nonfiction. And in addition to her writing career, she's worked as a politician for many years, serving on the science and technology and environmental committees for her political parties. So a really interesting life. Things to consider as you read. I'd like to kind of keep in mind some things you can compare your own life to this book. What does food mean to your culture, family, or community? How do people use food to communicate, showing love or not sometimes? Do you have specific family duties, expectations, responsibilities in your house? And if so, are those tied to traditional gender roles? That could even be a small thing, like in my family growing up, my father always took out the garbage. He felt like that was kind of what a man's job should be, and my mother always was the one to weed and tend the garden around the house, right? And so they were not necessarily people who had traditional gender roles. Both of them worked, but nonetheless that kind of came out in how the chores were broken up. So that's kind of what that question is pointing to. What does it look like when teenagers rebel? And what happens if they don't rebel, as they try to grow into adulthood, if they haven't struggled a little bit to form their own identity? In what ways is this a feminist novel? And what does the book have to say about family, culture, and forging one's own identity? So a little bit of history here. Before the Mexican Revolution. This is the events that take place kind of at the beginning of this novel and a little bit before it. So Mexico fell in debt to France, Britain, and Spain and suspended debt repayment. The French then invaded Mexico, attempting to establish a Mexican regime that would be more favorable to French interests. So we have some images here of people involved with that war. From 1861 to 1867, this is also around the time of the American Civil War. Over 30,000 Mexican and American soldiers were killed in battle. Another 11,000 were executed. Following this, the government of Mexico was very unstable. So there was this restored republic that was led by President Benito Juarez, but he unfortunately died in office. And there he is right there. He was succeeded by Sebastian Lerdo de Taja Corral. I'm so sorry, I took Latin, not Spanish in school, who helped to stabilize the country. However, when he ran for re-election, he was out. He won, but then they had a coup d'etat and he was kicked out. Leading this coup was Porfirio Diaz, a Mexican general and a veteran of the French invasion war. So basically, Diaz had led the coup based on the argument that the president should not be able to run for re-election. And then he established a dictatorship in which he was elected basically for 7 terms. And we see a fighter here with the, wearing the bullets and riding the horse and whatnot. So basically, as a result, although that was, his claims, we see this over and over again, right, with dictators who say the person in control right now has too much power, and then they take control, and then they have even more power than the original person did. It's very like Animal Farm. So as a result, 1876 to 1911, Diaz is the president, so-called, of Mexico. Then he finds himself running against Francisco Madero. He had Madero jailed. He held kind of a mock or like a kangaroo election and declared himself the winner. So at that point, revolutionaries, including Madero, as well as some others, Pascual Orozco, Pancho Villa, and Emiliano Zapata, rose up against the dictator. And this begins a really long conflict throughout Mexico. So there's a constitution drafted in 1917, and it tries to kind of formalize reforms that the rebel groups are seeking out, but these reforms really are on paper. Periodic violence between the government and the rebels continued into the 1930s when Lorenzo Cardenas took office, and then he institutionalizes reforms that were fought for during the revolution. So the relation to this novel, and I'll talk about microcosms in a bit, but basically you can see that there's a very oppressive government, and then there's various people trying to fight against that government and win more reform and freedom, things like that. So before the revolution, this is part of the issue, is that Porfirio, during the time of his dictatorship, Porfirio Diaz, he really made changes that did benefit the upper classes. And one historian says it was the time of greatest splendor, the first years of the 20th century between 1900 and 1910. The capital of the republic was transformed. The Frenchification in architecture, fashion, lifestyle takes hold, and there's a great number of public works put into place. So he has this obsession with being like France, being like Europe, and trying to bring Mexico into a more modern time. The problem is that in trying to do this, he is, part one, trying just to appeal to the Europeans, and part two, that some of these things really, I'm going to zoom in here, they really benefit some members of society, the wealthy elites, and they cause a huge gap between the wealthy and the poor. So you can see this woman here taking care of and acting as nanny, and you can see also how young she is while she's doing this, right? As opposed to these women who are in very fancy kind of what we would say Victorian attire, right, with the bustles and the corsets and the hats, which again, the fashion is just kind of echoing what's going on at the time. Now this picture, if you don't know fashion, you can tell that this is a little bit later. But again, we have the maybe middle class or poor down here, and then we have these very wealthy individuals here with their umbrellas and their long skirts and their pocket chains and pocket watches and top hats and all of that kind of thing. I'm sorry. So that is basically what happens. And so then you have an issue where there's child labor. There are people living in very desperate conditions in some parts of the country while other parts are thriving. So again, another historian says Porfirian Mexico always showed two faces. One of material progress, the other face of inequality was lacerating. The hacienda became a paradigm of exploitation. In some places like the Valle Nacional in Oaxaca and Yucatan, living conditions were close to slavery. The situation was no better for the workers, with working days of over 12 hours. Without the right to strike, without social security, the factories became veritable powder kegs. The Porfiriato put an end to public liberties. Society abdicated its political rights in exchange for the tinsel of stability and social peace, longed for almost a century. So again, you can see this very young girl and her even younger brother here working on the railroad. And then we have this family who has multiple children, and it looks possibly like two families maybe sharing this makeshift kind of house. So all of this is going on in the background of our book. And you can see this is the cinematic interpretation of that time period, showing some of the wealth that the family has and how many servants they have. And this has nothing to do with that, but it's from the ballet, and I just think it's interesting how that's staged. These are, before we get kind of moving from the history into some of the features of the novel, I thought I would give you guys some pictures of various covers of this book, which I just find really fascinating. The first one kind of focuses on the kitchen, family, food, the culture. Here she's making tortillas. The second one really is about food, but really passion, right? And taking things from the movie as well. And then the third looks more like a romance novel. So I think it's kind of interesting the way different people interpret this book. So, magical realism, as I mentioned before, this was a term coined by painters in the 1920s in Germany, and it was meant to draw a line between realistic paintings and those with fantastical elements, which is why I grabbed this really fascinating image right there. However, it didn't really describe a movement until the 1940s and 50s. And today it most often describes Latin American authors who write tales in a realistic environment with magical or supernatural elements. So part of the draw of magical realism is that it really blurs the line between realistic fiction, and in this case, historical fiction, and also fantasy by adding in elements like personified objects, ghost telepathy, hyperbolic meaning like improbable or exaggerated events, things that kind of maybe could happen but maybe couldn't. So you're supposed to kind of question things. The controversy with magical realism, first, there's debate over what truly consists of a magical realist book. Authors from all over the globe have written these types of works, even though they really are most associated with Latin America. But part of that controversy examines whether some authors are guilty of cultural appropriation. Professor Wendy Ferris explains, Latin American writers want to claim their movement as the origin, the home, and the only true birthplace of magical realism. This is particularly true because magical realism was popularized in countries that had been colonized. So again, kind of like the book itself, we're seeing colonization, oppression of culture, and imposition of another culture, and then people trying to have creative output that fights against that and that expresses their culture in a unique way. Some other controversies. Some Latin authors resent the constraints and expectations placed on them and their work. Central and South American literature is comprised of much more than just magical realist books. Many readers and scholars kind of don't acknowledge that. There are books of all genres in all countries, right? So sometimes Latinx authors feel like pigeonholed, I guess. That's how I would put it. And sometimes magical realism is seen as something like exotic, even though, again, authors from across the globe have produced this type of work. So another professor, Maria Tegolander from Deakin University, she argues that the whole movement relies on fakery by presenting the lives of Latin Americans in fantastical terms and playing off the fantasy as somehow kind of truer than their lives. She notes that this isn't necessarily a criticism of magical realism so much as an attempt to understand how it represents Latin American cultures. And this is a question that you can look at in this novel. Like, we'll talk about the narration in a moment, but we have a narrator kind of removed from the events by time. So these things happened long ago. So how much of the magic took place and how much are kind of the more fantastical retellings by this family? Major characters. So I mentioned a few of these already. Tita is the youngest daughter of Mama Elena. She's a bit strong-willed, but she's trying to keep that in check. Her passionate nature is suppressed by her family and her culture. She communicates emotions through food, taking on eventually the role as the cook in her family's estate. Mama Elena is a tyrannical, authoritarian parent who runs both the family ranch and her daughter's lives. I don't also want to paint her as just being one-dimensional because we do find out more about her life and why she's like this later on in the book, but I also don't want to ruin that surprise for you either because when it comes, I think it's very interesting and it kind of gives a little more depth to this character. Pedro is Tita's love. He struggles to show strength of character or imagination, and again, he marries her sister. Nacha starts out as the family cook. She nurses Tita when Mama Elena is unable to and mentors her in the kitchen, acting as a second or more nurturing mother figure. Gertrudis is the oldest sister, and she is a passionate, free-spirited woman who runs off with the revolutionaries to join that fight. Then we have Rosara, the middle sister, the wife of Pedro. She causes Tita further pain when she determines that and proclaims that she's going to follow in Mama Elena's footsteps and not allow her youngest daughter to marry and force her only daughter to basically care for her forever. And then we also have John Brown, who appears a little bit later in the novel. He's a family doctor who becomes enchanted by Tita's beauty and kindness. The structure of the book is kind of interesting. So there's this frame narrative in which we realize that years earlier, Tita's niece Esperanza finds her cookbook in some ashes with like fertile ground underneath the ashes. There's a little bit of symbolism there. So the book basically then is passed down from Esperanza to her daughter, and then we get the narrative, these family stories from Esperanza's daughter. She recounts these almost like a fairy tale version of the family lore. It may have been magical from the start, or the magical elements may have been kind of added in as part of this like oral tradition, passing these stories down through the years. A recipe is given at the beginning of each chapter, which reinforces the importance of food, family, culture, celebrations, and even the passing of time and the changing of seasons. So each chapter is named after a month, even though this takes place over several years. At one point, we also have a recipe for matches, which doesn't start the chapter, but demonstrates some of the differences in Tita's life at that point where she's left the kitchen for a bit. As some scholars have noted, the structure also attests to the female bonding and creativity that can emerge within a focus on the domestic arts. So cooking as being kind of region or realm or responsibility of, it's a lot of R's, region, realm, or responsibility of women, and a place that women can have some control, some power, and of course some creativity. So the narrative point of view, again, is pretty far removed from the time in which the story takes place, but she's recounting things that she really could not possibly know. At times, we're told about inner thoughts and the feelings of Tita, even inanimate objects. For example, at one point she says Tita and the table knew what had happened. However, it's not completely omniscient narration. Instead, it really is limited and focused on Tita, her life, and her inner world. So there are many characters whose thoughts, feelings, actions were unaware. For example, I mentioned Gertrudis and how she runs away. We don't really know what happened to her for a bit. We find out secondhand. It's not something that the narrator tells us. A more omniscient narrator would have also followed Gertrudis, reported on what happened, what Gertrudis sees, what Gertrudis feels, that kind of thing. And then also would tell us more about Mama Elena and her reasons for her actions, Rosara, what she's feeling, why she marries Pedro, right? Because it doesn't, we're really left to interpret the actions and the words of the characters, which makes the book really quite interesting, I think. So, literary foils. We have several foil characters in this book. A foil character is someone who contrasts with another character, and this contrast between two characters helps to emphasize strengths or weaknesses, highlight other personality traits to make those traits even more prominent for the reader. For example, a protagonist might have opposite qualities to an antagonist, which demonstrates just how wonderful our hero or heroine actually is. So in this novel, we have a couple of pairings. We have Mama Elena and Nacha. One is kind of an authoritarian control. The other is a more sensitive, nurturing mother figure. We have Tita and Rosara, who are kind of like rebellion and passion versus adherence to tradition. We have Dr. John Brown and Pedro, who kind of represent stability and caring versus a more lustful, forbidden love. So in addition to those literary foils, as I have here at the top, take a look especially at the differences between men and women and the roles that they take and how they're conforming to or rebelling against those roles. And really also, we talk about how the women are affected in a patriarchy, but men are affected as well by this kind of very controlling system. Microcosm. So I mentioned this word a little bit ago. In literature, a microcosm is a small, self-contained world that reflects the characteristics, complexities, and dynamics of the larger world or society. It's like a little miniature version of society in the book that mirrors or symbolizes larger structures and conflicts, but allows the author to also delve into or dig into more intimate aspects of human nature, relationship, emotions, etc. So many of us had to enjoy or suffer through, depending on how you see it, The Lord of the Flies, the island where the boys try to create a society and then it falls apart. That's a microcosm for the larger world, which is in the midst of war. In this book, the dictatorship and rebellion in the De la Garza household and ranch serves as a microcosm of the dictatorship and rebellion of Mexico. The ranch is governed by strict rule, which reflects the constraints put upon women in the early 20th century in Mexico, as well as the ways in which oppressive societal norms restrict freedom and self-expression. The forbidden love between Tita and Pedro and the impact of her cooking kind of symbolize the larger struggles between tradition and change as well. So what I love about this book is, yes, it is specific to Mexico at this particular point in time, from the 1870s to the early 1920s, 1930s, but it also has these universal themes, right? The clash between parents and children, generational differences, family culture, identity, especially when you have a strong family or a strong family culture that kind of dictates a little bit or tells you what your identity should be. So, some symbols to look for. The book title refers to an expression like water for hot chocolate, which literally means water just at its boiling point, or figuratively, symbolically meaning intense emotions just on the verge of boiling over and exploding. Each recipe starting the chapter holds some kind of symbolic meaning, as do the magical effects of the food. So, really think about what is being made, the ingredients that go into it, why those ingredients are so important. This is a ranch where they have their own chickens, they're gathering their own eggs, they are at one point preparing roosters to be eaten. So they are really connected to the food. It's like farm to table, right? They're really connected to the food that they're providing. The kitchen, again, women's domain and a place in which she can express herself. The book also refers to temperatures at many points. So hot being really passionate, cold being maybe emotional neglect or sadness, depression, those kind of things. There is a bedspread that Tita crochets throughout the novel. This is something that I think is a little bit more of its time, but women used to have like a hope chest with things that they had sewn or created. So that would go with them from their youth to their adulthood once they got married. So things like the bedspread that would go on the marital bed, sometimes sheets, sometimes really intricate lace, things of that nature. And here, Tita knows that she's not allowed to marry. So in some ways, she's very stuck, and we see her putting some of her emotions in another art form that is often thought of something that women do, right, through sewing and crocheting. We have the frenzied castrating of 200 roosters, which might symbolize the taking away of vitality, the ability to reproduce in a very oppressive and, again, a really frenzied way. So those are some of the symbols. There's a lot more, but I don't want to give too much away as you read. So one theme, gender roles. Tita is forced into this limited domestic sphere based on a little bit on her gender. But her mother, Mama Elena, really is not. She has quite a bit of agency in this book. She rules her household. She's a matriarch, meaning a family run by women. And though we also learn of some of her indiscretions as a youth and some of her hopes and dreams and how those were quashed as well, and why she kind of found herself in a position where she had to run things. So it's kind of interesting that you can kind of interpret it in different ways. How much agency does she have? But in this way, we examine not just the gender roles imposed by a patriarchal society that's run at this point by dictators and male dictators in particular. We also look at the way that women hurt each other and help uphold such systems. And we see other characters being affected by those systems as well. Rosara struggles to fit into her role as a wife and mother. It affects her body. She becomes more and more ill. Gertrudis finds a type of freedom after leaving the ranch, but she also struggles for a time as well while trying to throw off conventional expectations. And other themes that you can look for, I love that picture too. Love and passion and food, mother and mother figures, the supernatural, not just in the food, but it comes through in other ways. Again, I don't want to give that away yet. Mental illness and mental health, and how this oppression really affects people mentally and emotionally. Creativity and creative output and being able to express oneself. Duty and obedience, control and repression. I'm just going to go through. There we go. Rebellion and expression, war, violence, and abuse. There is some in the book as the war gets closer and closer and closes in on the ranch that's been kind of a peaceful place in terms of the war not coming in and affecting things. Food is connection, food is communication, storytelling, family and home versus the outside world, and then things like marriage, emotional affairs, which can be just as damaging as physical affairs, and lust versus love, which is something I really want you guys to think about if you're in my class, and if you're not, think about it anyway, if you're reading this book, who is really showing love, and what does love actually mean, and how is that different from physical lusts and passions. If you like this book, here are some others I recommend. Some of these are books of magical realism. The Night Circus, The Particular Sadness of Lemon Cake has some things in it kind of like this with the food and emotions and things like that. House on Mango Street, How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents. One of those is told backwards chronologically, and I don't remember right now which one it is. They're both very good books. Laura Esquivel also wrote this great book called The Law of Love. And Love in the Time of Cholera and Beloved are also wonderful books as well. So if you enjoy this, these are some others you might enjoy. Sorry for all the interruptions while I was recording this. Have a great day, everyone, and I look forward to seeing your thoughts about this book. Thanks.